The Syntax of Things by Arisha. Chapter 10. Wisdom. Disruptions. Something was wrong. At first, Harry thought he was just tired, so he left the magazine aside for another day. Then he tried again, and it kept happening, or rather, it kept not happening. So today, it was his third attempt, and despite looking at the pictures, he didn't physically respond. At all. It was terrifying. He threw the magazine aside and rubbed his forehead, staring at the ceiling and struggling to figure out what was happening. It wasn't but a few days ago that he could hardly wait to find some time to look closely at these moving images. He had no second thoughts or guilt about his theft. And he did look at them late at night once Snape was asleep and couldn't bother him anymore, which was normal, and he felt excited. Normal. But not physically excited. Not normal. His first assumption was that the issue was somehow spelled to destroy the reader's hormones, but when he touched himself again, the way he always did all his life, which was with the company of his own thoughts in the shower, he responded just fine. So he had it been cursed. He shot the magazine a dirty look and was suddenly worried that there might be a medical reason behind this new problem. Or perhaps he just wasn't used to looking at stuff. Puberty is hell, he thought. He kicked at his bedclothes, annoyed. When Harry woke up in the morning, he felt something ugly tightening his chest. With his eyes still closed, he mentally searched for the source of the sentiment, going over the day before and the possible obligations he might have forgotten. Then he opened his eyes and jumped out of bed at once. Friday. Snape's errands. He was with Voldemort. He had to be. He willed his rage away, deciding that choking on it was not going to be helpful. He hadn't felt this way since Sirius's death. The memories that came with the familiar stress were something he'd prefer to never recall again. He did certainly not worry about Snape. It was the solidity of the house wards that unnerved him. If something happened to Snape, Harry would be locked in here until someone discovered him. If ever. Waiting. Starving to death. He dressed up quickly and opened the door to Snape's bedroom. It was empty. Making a mental note to go through Snape's closet again later, he checked the clock. Almost noon. How long had he slept? His mind couldn't have found a more inappropriate day to sleep through its worries. Snape. He ran down the stairs, but the kitchen and the living room were empty too. This wasn't fair. He was living with a murderer who was responsible for his parents' deaths. Snape should be the dead one instead of his parents. Kicking the armchair stubbornly, he went back upstairs to take a shower and brush his teeth. After what seemed like hours, he ended up in the living room with a glass of water and some biscuits. Waiting. And waiting. And waiting. Could Voldemort have killed Snape? Harry didn't think Voldemort would have any reason to do so, or so he hoped. Not that Harry would be aware of it, even if there were one. No one seemed to consider the option of sharing information with him. Memories of Voldemort raising his wand flashed and stretched in his mind. He thought of the cemetery, of the night Voldemort returned from the dead. Don't think of Cedric, he told himself. Don't! Thinking about what had already happened wasn't going to help. He knew that. Reason wasn't enough to keep Sirius or Cedric out of his mind, though, and he had always been soft when it came to these particular emotions. Dumbledore trusted Snape. Harry fixed his jaw. If Dumbledore trusted Snape, Harry didn't have another option either. Even if he hated Snape all the same. And if Snape was killed, Harry would have to go back to the Dursleys. Once again, he shrugged stubbornly at his anger for having to live with Snape instead of Sirius. Stop. Harry didn't need any of them anyway. Going back to the Dursleys would be just as good. At least the Dursleys hadn't killed anyone. Perhaps he should contact Dumbledore. But if Snape was all right, he'd be furious to know that Harry had made a fuss about it. And maybe his errands were real errands that had nothing to do with Voldemort and Harry's raving imagination anyway. He tried to imagine Snape waiting in line to pay his bills and failed. Maybe he was having a crucial conversation with other Death Eaters or something. Maybe they were arguing about the best way to kill Harry, and that was why he was late. Maybe they were plotting a new way to capture the Chosen One. Harry thought of going upstairs and taking his wand just in case, when someone knocked on the door. Hard. Snape had keys. Harry approached the door carefully. Who's there? He asked, his voice croaky. Whoever it was, they banged on the door again, this time harder. It'd be stupid to open the door to a stranger, Harry knew it, and even more stupid to do so without his wand at hand. But Snape was gone, and this couldn't be good, and maybe he was just lying on the other side of the door, injured, too weak to talk, and in need of immediate help. It'd take less than a minute to fetch his wand, and his fingers twitched in agreement. His impulse decided against it. Swallowing the foul bile on his throat, Harry opened. It wasn't Snape. It wasn't anyone he knew, in fact. The tall man glared down at him with a wary and yet unfocused look. There was a kind of people that passed by unnoticed, and Harry knew that well. People who walked in the streets, head bowed, hands in pockets, and no one bothered to throw a second look at them or remember them by the end of the day. Like wizards under the strongest spells that slipped and vanished between the unsuspecting muggles to reach their distant destination. This man was the exact opposite. Harry knew he would have stopped to take a look at him anywhere. And as much as Harry wanted to be brave and strong, as he looked up at the unreasonably disgusted glare peering at him, he felt small. It was contradictory because the man didn't look wealthy or powerful, quite the opposite. Harry had the suspiciousness that he was a muggle. His short grey hair was sparse and unkempt. The large jacket he wore seemed too warm for such a sunny day, and it carried stains of dirt all over. "Hello?" said Harry. The man didn't respond. He looked at Harry from head to toe as though trying to make out something perplexing. Harry shifted to his feet. Aunt Petunia would have had his head for mindlessly opening the door to beggars. The man pushed Harry aside hard and rushed inside. "Hey!" shouted Harry, rubbing his shoulder. The man strode into the living room, and Harry followed him furiously, watching him pull random books from the bookcases and throw them on the floor. "What do you think you're doing? Who are you? Get out of here!" The man muttered something through his teeth and tossed aside the sofa's cushions. Harry stood still, not knowing what to do. He sometimes thought that this was exactly why he was such a troublesome person. He didn't think. "Are you deaf? I told you to get out. I'll call the police." He yelled again. He should hex him, but he didn't know if he was allowed to use magic while Snape wasn't home, and the last thing he wanted was to be interrogated by the Ministry for living with Severus Snape, and even worse for using magic while doing so, too. The man swept over and slapped Harry hard across the face. "I will not take orders in my own house, boy! Who the hell are you?" the man asked. Harry's eyes stung as he held his burning cheek. "Never mind, look. Either stay out of my business or help me out. There's this ring. Blue stone. Wouldn't even notice it's missing. No harm, no foul, right? Have you seen it? He hid it somewhere, didn't he?" Harry narrowed his eyes, studying the man's features. A feeling of disbelief came over him. It wasn't exactly fear, but something colder and much less intimate. Revulsion, maybe. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. "You're his father." "Have you seen it?" the man repeated, walking past Harry to the armchair. Taking a dagger out of his pocket, he ripped apart the fabric and shoved his hand inside. He suddenly stopped his searching and looked up. "You're not his son, are you?" Harry shook his head. "I don't think he has children." Harry watched, not knowing what to do. "When is he coming back?" "Soon, and you should leave now. Get out." "Let him go. Fuck himself. What are you to him?" His student." "Nothing to him, are you? How'd you have the nerve to be in here, in my house? My house! Put it with my fucking money to roof that whore. Thrown out of my own house, right out of nowhere. Now where's that damn thing? The man was beyond any doubt severely intoxicated, and he was destroying Snape's home, and Snape wasn't going to kill Harry for letting him in. At that precise moment, a clanking sound was heard from the outdoor, and Harry turned to see the door being unlocked. It opened swiftly, and Snape slowly came in. He looked at Harry as though to say something, when the other Snape swore again from the other room, and something like more books being thrown around was heard. Harry could tell the exact moment Snape realized they weren't alone, and his blood ran cold as he gave Harry a deadly stare. It was in the space of a heartbeat that Harry came down to the conclusion that it'd be wiser for him to not talk. Snape quickly strode over to where the sound had come from, his shoes barely audible against the floor. Harry followed too, the numbness finally wearing off his legs. Snape stopped a few feet away from where the man was, and after a long moment he raised his wand. "You," he breathed. "You dare come here." His father snapped into laughter. "You son of a cunt! You have some humor after all!" Snape remained at his spot, his hand twitching dangerously around his wand. "You have been warned to never appear near this house again." Only now Snape seemed to realize the chaos around him, and he slowly rounded the coffee table. "What have you done?" "You have something that belongs to me. I bought it for her years ago. It's mine now. I want it back." After everything she suffered because of you, hissed Snape. His father laughed again. I'm not here to go over the same bullshit again, Severus. There's a ring somewhere here with a blue stone on top. Do you remember it? Snape glared hard. You want it back? The man nodded. Snape nodded too. They stared. Ed stared. Harry shifted again, fighting the urge to clear his throat. After another long moment, Snape stormed over and grabbed the man by the shoulders. He pushed him against the wall with such savagery that the man's head was slammed back. Snape's fist clenched around his father's shirt collar, and he almost pulled him up. His voice was barely above a whisper when he talked. Get out, or I'll kill you. Obviously realizing that he didn't stand a chance in taking what he had come for, the man seemed to consider his options. He scanned the room with his eyes for one last time, and, after fixing his shirt, he spat on the floor, his eyes locked with Snape's. He pushed once more past Harry and slammed the door hard behind him. Snape was still staring at the wall, as if his father hadn't left at all. His wand was still in his hand, but his arm was hanging limp at his side. In the complete silence of the room, Harry's mind seemed to finally awake, and he suddenly decided he should say something, only he didn't know what. Somehow there weren't words wise enough to interrupt the moment, and even if they were, he doubted that Snape would want to hear them from him. Harry was at last granted with a bizarre look, as though Snape realized for the first time that he had been in the room with them all along. He stared back, the usual defensive anger he had developed around Snape now absent from the pit of his stomach. Snape looked as though trying to determine whether Harry pitied him or was just satisfying his curiosity. He did neither, and only now he could breathe away the worry that had overwhelmed him earlier, the fear that something bad might have happened. Snape was alive. Harry almost grinned. Snape didn't. Surprisingly uninterested in the ruined living room, he kicked at the books lying on the floor dismissively and hurried upstairs. Harry folded his arms over his chest, sparing a moment to check if the open books hid anything interesting inside. They didn't, and the simplicity of Snape's few belongings only made the situation more depressive. Snape's life was indeed messed up too, after all, and it also looked like they weren't going to practice occlumency today, either. Thinking hard, Harry ran up and fetched his wand. He spelled the books back in place and left on the table those who had been ripped apart for later restoration. He cast some spells at the sofa and the armchair too. Pushing the armchair back in place, he carefully picked up Snape's cloak. It was a plain robe, much like every other robe Snape wore, black, made of thin silk fabric, and it had the characteristic scent of Snape on it. It slipped easily between his fingers, and its folds shone darker at some parts. Harry's hands were sweating again. He threw it over the armchair. Against his better judgment, Harry silently climbed up the stairs and stood outside Snape's bedroom. He thought hard. Running back to his room, he left his wand on the bed, picked up a random school notebook and a pen, and returned. He knocked.